Hello, my name is Andrew Thake. I'm with Fiona Clouder, who's the founder of Clouder Vista, and she's also a consultant, an ambassador, and an expert within Latin America. Great to have you with us today, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Fiona, you've talked a lot about the urgency of the energy transition. Where is the mining industry succeeding, and where can it improve?
Andrew, as you know, I was previously the regional ambassador in Latin America and the Caribbean on COP26, so the big UN climate change conference that the UK hosted in Glasgow. And I felt at that time we did move the world back in 2021, not enough, not fast enough. But nonetheless, governments made lots and lots of commitments, very important commitments, of which the energy transition was a key component. And what really struck me then, and strikes me even more now, is that there was a disconnect between the policy commitments and aspirations and the reality of the materials that are needed to make the energy transition happen. And so what I've become very interested in is this interface between governments, the mining industry, and then those looking at energy policy, energy transition, and other changes in our society. I think the mining industry is actually doing a lot more than it's being given credit for. I think there's a lot of progress. If I think back to when I originally got involved in mining over a decade ago, back when I was ambassador to Chile, I think the industry has moved. It's actually moved fast. It's looking at its own carbon footprint. It's embedding innovations in use of water, in use of energy within the industry, etc. And also it's playing a greater role in looking at scaling up of the material supply. But what I'm really concerned about is to what extent we're actually facing up collectively to this global issue. We have, of course, very complicated geopolitics in the world now, but this requirement of materials that are needed quickly, a coherent, collaborative, coordinated approach to ensure the energy transition, to ensure economic prosperity, to ensure also benefits to society, and also being realistic, the defence and security side. To me, we don't seem to be looking at that as a coherent problem, and nor are we looking at it with the necessary sense of urgency.
So given that, what do you think of the three pillars of the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan?
Well, I think they're absolutely the right things, looking at building standards, looking at mobilising capital, looking at strategic partnerships, and promoting innovation across the whole supply chain. And there's a lot of work going on, both at government level, also with organisations. For example, the ICMM have been a key player on all of this. But again, we're all very good at coming up with plans or commenting on what's needed, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody. But I still don't see the practicality and urgency of action. So I think there are some key people, some individuals and some individual companies that are really moving ahead with these agendas. I think there are organisations, the G7 is one, the IEA is another. There are governments, for example, the work we're seeing of Saudi Arabia and the Future Minerals Forum, driving a lot of this forward. But it's not being done in a very coherent way. It's a very opportunistic way, where countries and companies are in competition with one another, and perhaps understandably, but ultimately we're facing a changing world and we've got to face that together.
You mentioned that you were COP26 Regional Ambassador and you're now working on COP30 planning in Latin America. How can COP platforms be leveraged to accelerate regulation and investment in responsible critical minerals mining?
I think Brazil faces a very important challenge at a very important moment in time. And I know a lot of great work is being done by Brazil in taking the whole COP agenda forward. COP is, of course, a mechanism under the United Nations that historically has been focused on climate change, and hence it's been all the environmental policymakers that get together. And so there is a whole momentum building on the Paris Agreement and all the commitments that stem from that. And that will be taken forward very rightly in COP30. I think what we did as the UK presidency in COP26 was we really embedded these issues in the real world. So obviously at the core of the negotiations are the environmental policymakers, but we involve business, and crucially we involve civil society, communities and regional leaders. And so that generated a more collective approach on climate change per se. What I would hope to see in COP30, I think it's not clear yet how much of that is going to happen, is also a more integrated approach that still gives great prominence to the environmental considerations. And obviously it's very symbolic that COP30 itself is to be held in Berlin, in the Amazon, in Brazil. But I hope that part of that, there will also be more involvement of the mining industry to talk about some of these very issues. And a big part of that has to be about galvanizing finance. And again, we saw through the earlier COP mechanism, the work done by Paris, the work done by the UK, and other COPs in between, and subsequently, to bring in the business and finance community on the climate side. Now I hope we can do more to mobilize the finance community also in relation to the integration with mining and the energy transition. And I think there's very important work to be done there. It helps businesses, it helps the capital markets. It's something that we could do more on in the UK. And I know, Andrew, you yourself, through Resourcing Tomorrow, are doing great things with the London Stock Exchange. And I think the role of the City of London also in galvanising this agenda is very, very important.
You've just emphasised there Brazil and I guess like Latin America's pivotal role in supplying critical minerals. How can mining companies and investors scale operations sustainably in that region without repeating the mistakes of past resource booms?
Right. So I think it's both companies and investors, and it's also the governments. And so Latin America historically has perhaps not been a part of the world many companies from the West have focused on. Also, people, I mean, we've just been talking about your own trip to Latin America. It's not till people go there that they really see what a great region it is, what a lot it has to offer. And so there's lots of baggage and history and misperceptions about the region. But these are, first of all, modern dynamic economies. They generally have good governance and good institutions. It varies country to country. Latin America also has a reputation for volatile politics, heavy swings from the left to the right. But in all of that, whoever is in charge in whichever country, and we've got lots of elections coming up across the region in the next year, but the important thing is mining is fundamental to the economies of Latin America. So in a way, whoever is in charge, they're going to have to make mining a priority in most of the countries in the region. And companies need to play into that, and investors, there is a fantastic opportunity there in the region. Because this region holds a huge proportion of the world's reserves in many critical minerals. So everyone's very focused on lithium, for example, but there's also graphite, there's rare earths, there's also, of course, the huge supply of copper that's needed, and several other critical minerals are prominent in the region. But in the West approaching that, this has to be through real partnership. It's not about the pure transaction simply to secure the supply. And that's where I feel Western and other governments do not take the time to understand the region, to build relationships with the region, and to listen to the region. Equally, the countries in Latin America perhaps need to be a little more vocal and a little higher profile in articulating both what they've got to offer and also what they require of partnerships. And so in optimizing those reserves for the region, that has to come with investments in infrastructure. It has to come with real partnerships for communities, and also to recognise the importance of biodiversity and environmental standards. And this is not just a tick box exercise. This is something that can be a win-win for everybody.
One last question. Given geopolitical tensions around concentration in processing, such as China, what practical role do private equity partners like Appian, who obviously you consult and work for, play in helping diversify global supply chains, and what roadblocks remain?
Yeah, so I'm an independent advisor to Appian, and they are an example of a leading private equity investor that are a very important player in this industry. And Appian is an example where they have done a lot of work, for example, with SAFE in the US, looking at global supply chains and helping bringing together groups of investors to look at these opportunities. And I think that's where we need to see that happening much more and in a much more diverse way. So Appian is not the only player, there are others. But again, that's where I think the work, Andrew, that you're doing through Resourcing Tomorrow, the government roundtable that we've been organising, that also brings in both the investors and the companies to debate some of these issues. And what I'd like to see us doing is much more focus on practical action planning. So not just creating frameworks for dialogue, but actually between us coming up with some practical steps that will really make a difference in this sector.
Fiona Clouder, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. We really look forward to seeing you at Resourcing tomorrow, both the government roundtable on the 1st of December at the London Stock Exchange and at Resourcing tomorrow itself on the 2nd to the 4th of December. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.